They told us it was a routine extraction. Grid reference, 40 clicks past the wire, no civilians, no press. I signed the non-disclosure before I even knew the mission name. 6 of us went in, 4 of us came back. But the 4 who returned don't agree on what year it is. I've stopped arguing with them. I've started writing this down because someone needs a record before they take it from me too. The sky out there doesn't move the way skies should. I've sat in 100 briefing rooms in my career. I know the smell of stale coffee and cold steel, the hum of fluorescent lights that never quite stop flickering. But that room was different. No windows, no unit patches on the walls. Just 4 bare walls, a steel table, and a colonel I had never seen before in 15 years of service. He didn't introduce himself. He just slid a folder across the table and told us to sign before we read it. That should have been the first warning. You don't sign a blank check with your life and call it routine. But we did it anyway, because that's what we were trained to do. Trust the chain of command. Don't ask questions above your pay grade. The folder had almost nothing in it. A grid reference. A single satellite image, grainy, overexposed, like it had been taken through a lens that didn't want to focus. No enemy combatant briefing, no intelligence summary, just 6 names, mine included, and a departure time before sunrise. I remember Ramirez leaning over to me whispering, "This another ghost op?" I didn't answer him. I'd heard stories, the kind passed around at 2 a.m. on long watches, about units that got pulled for missions that never existed on paper, missions that made men disappear into transfers nobody could confirm. I told myself those were just stories built to scare new recruits. The colonel spoke for exactly 4 minutes. He said the objective was a structure, unconfirmed origin, in a restricted zone 40 kilometers past the wire. He said our job was to secure and observe. He said nothing about hostiles. He said nothing about what we were observing, or why 6 soldiers with 0 specialized training were being sent to look at something that apparently required this level of secrecy. When I asked what kind of structure, he looked at me the way you look at someone who just asked a question with an answer they wouldn't survive knowing. "You'll see it," he said. "Everything you need is in the folder." The folder had nothing. We were dismissed without a Q&A. No one in that room asked the question sitting in all our throats. Why does a colonel none of us recognize have authority to detach a 6-man team from active rotation without a single support asset behind him? Nobody asked, because in 20 years of combined service between us, none of us had ever seen paperwork move that fast, that quiet, that clean. Clean paperwork means someone powerful wants no trace. I walked out of that briefing with a knot in my stomach I couldn't explain. It wasn't fear of combat. I'd done combat. This was different. A low, cold pressure behind my sternum. The kind you get right before a car crash, you can see coming but can't stop. Voss joined us an hour later. She was the science attaché, some kind of geologist or physicist. I never got a straight answer. She had 2 aluminum cases and a look on her face like she hadn't slept in days. She didn't talk to any of us during equipment check. She kept glancing at her cases like she was afraid they'd open on their own. We loaded the Black Hawks at 0430. The air was cold, still, unnaturally quiet. No insects, no wind. Just the deep thrum of rotor blades cutting into silence that felt wrong, like the desert itself was holding its breath. I climbed in last, and as we lifted off, I looked toward the cockpit. Neither pilot turned around. Not once. Not during pre-flight checks, not during liftoff, not when Ramirez cracked a joke about the in-flight service being terrible. They kept their eyes forward, rigid, like men who had flown this exact route before and knew better than to look at their passengers. That's the detail that stuck with me the longest. Not the missing paperwork, not the unnamed colonel, the pilots who wouldn't look back. We flew north into darkness, engines steady, altitude climbing past what should have been standard for the terrain. Below us, the desert stretched out flat and endless, lit only by starlight, and something about the horizon looked stretched, slightly warped, like heat distortion, except the air was freezing. I closed my eyes and told myself it was fatigue, told myself the mission was routine, that by 0800 we'd be back at base swapping complaints about bad coffee and worse orders. I believed that for exactly 30 more minutes, because that's when the compass in my hand started spinning in a way no compass should, and Ramirez, sitting across from me, went very still, staring out the window at a sun that hadn't moved even though 2 hours had passed. We load into the helicopters before sunrise, and I notice none of the pilots will look back at us. The compass spun for 11 full seconds before it settled. I counted. Counting is what you do when your training refuses to accept what your eyes are showing you. We touched down at 0530, 40 kilometers past the wire, in terrain that matched nothing on our satellite imagery. The dunes were the wrong shape. The rock formations that should have marked our route north were instead scattered south, as if someone had picked up the whole map and rotated it without telling anyone. Doyle, our navigator, the best I'd ever worked with, recalibrated his gear 3 times in the first 20 minutes. I watched him do it a 4th time when he thought no one was looking. His hands weren't shaking from cold. The temperature had climbed since dawn, thick desert heat pressing down on us, sweat beating under my collar within minutes. Doyle's hands were shaking from something else. "GPS says we're exactly where we're supposed to be," he muttered. "But the terrain doesn't match. None of it matches." I asked him if the satellite data could be old. He shook his head slowly. "Sat data was captured 6 days ago. Terrain like this doesn't just rearrange itself in 6 days." We pushed forward on foot, boots sinking into sand that felt strangely dense, almost like walking on wet concrete instead of fine grain. Every step sent a small vibration up through my legs, a low-frequency hum I felt more than heard, like standing near a generator buried somewhere beneath us. Ramirez broke the silence 20 minutes in. He wasn't joking this time. His voice had lost its usual edge. "Hey, Sarge, why hasn't the sun moved?" I looked up. He was right. The sun sat exactly where it had at first light, low on the horizon, casting long shadows that hadn't shifted an inch in 2 hours of hard march. I checked my watch. It read 0742. My body told me we'd been walking far longer than that. My legs ached with the fatigue of a 4-hour march, not a 2-hour one. Voss caught up to us, breathing hard, her 2 aluminum cases clutched against her chest like a mother protecting a child. She glanced at the sun, then at her own watch, then said something under her breath I didn't catch. When I asked her to repeat it, she just shook her head and told me to keep moving. The silence around us thickened. No birds, no insects, no wind moving the sand. Just our boots, our breathing, and that low hum beneath the ground, growing steadily louder the further north we walked. It was the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums, makes you want to speak just to hear a human voice confirm you're not alone. At the 2-hour mark by my watch, though every man in that unit would have sworn under oath it had been closer to 5, Doyle stopped dead in his tracks and pointed at the ground. A perfectly straight line, black as tar, ran through the sand ahead of us, stretching to the horizon in both directions like someone had drawn it with a ruler the size of the world. We approached carefully. It wasn't a shadow. It wasn't a crack in rock. It was a seam, smooth, cold to the touch even under the relentless heat, running deeper into the earth than any of our equipment could measure. Voss knelt beside it, ran her gloved fingers along the edge, and went pale. "This material," she said quietly, "doesn't exist. Not in any catalog. Not in any survey I've studied." She looked up at me, and for the first time since I'd met her hours earlier, I saw real fear behind her eyes. Not caution. Fear. We followed the seam for another kilometer, and that's when the structure came into view. A jagged silhouette breaking the flat horizon, angular, ancient-looking, despite jutting up from ground that should have eroded any structure decades ago, if not centuries. It didn't look built. It looked grown or carved by something that understood geometry the way we understand breathing, instinctively and without the need for tools. The closer we got, the louder the hum became, no longer just beneath our feet, but seemingly coming from the structure itself, resonating through the ground and into our boots, our knees, our chests. Ramirez put his hand against his sternum like he was trying to keep something from shaking loose inside him. Then, without warning, every radio on our team cut to static. Not weak signal, not interference, just a wall of white noise, sudden and absolute, as if something had reached out and severed us from the rest of the world the moment we crossed some invisible threshold in the sand. I looked back the way we'd come. The tracks of our own boots were already gone, erased, the sand smooth and undisturbed behind us, like the desert had closed the door the second we stepped through it. Then Ramirez points at the horizon and asks why the sun hasn't moved in 2 hours. Up close, the structure didn't make sense, and the closer we got, the less sense it made. It rose maybe 60 meters out of the ground, black stone veined with something that caught no light despite the sun overhead. A material Voss would later call non-reflective in a way that violates basic optics. The surface wasn't smooth like polished rock, and it wasn't rough like natural formation. It was carved deliberately, precisely, with patterns that hurt to look at directly. Not disturbing in subject, disturbing in geometry. Angles that seemed to fold into themselves the longer you stared. Lines that appeared to converge toward a vanishing point that shouldn't exist on a flat facade. Voss walked its perimeter with a handheld scanner, her lips moving in silent calculation, and every few steps she'd stop, recheck a reading, mutter a number under her breath like it physically pained her to say it out loud. I asked her for a status update. She didn't answer for almost a full minute. Carbon dating puts material degradation consistent with roughly 11,000 years of exposure, she finally said. But there's zero erosion consistent with that age. It should be dust by now. It should be gone. She looked at the structure like it had personally lied to her. This shouldn't still be standing. Not like this. Not this intact. We found the entrance on the northern face. Not a door, no hinges, no seams, just an opening precisely rectangular, waist to head height, as though something had simply willed a section of solid stone into absence. Cold air rolled out of it in a slow, steady exhale, chilling the sweat on my neck instantly. That cold had a smell to it, mineral, faintly metallic, underlaid with something organic I couldn't place and didn't want to. Command protocol said we call in before entry. I tried the radio. Nothing but static, thick, and directionless, like standing inside a shell pressed to your ear except amplified 1,000 times. Doyle tried his handheld. Same result. We were 40 clicks past the wire with no working comms, standing in front of an opening that shouldn't exist in a structure that shouldn't exist, and every instinct in my body told me to turn the team around and march back to the extraction point. I didn't. God help me. I didn't. Because that was the mission, and I still believed at that point that following orders meant something would make sense on the other side of this. I was wrong. Nothing made sense after that threshold. Nothing ever would again. Inside, our flashlights cut through darkness that seemed to resist the light, swallowing it at the edges of the beam instead of scattering naturally across the walls. The corridor sloped downward at a gentle grade, wide enough for 2 men abreast, and the walls bore the same impossible carvings as the exterior. Geometric, precise, occasionally interrupted by long vertical grooves that Voss photographed obsessively, murmuring that they resembled nothing in any known linguistic or architectural record on Earth. 20 meters in, Doyle's watch stopped. Just stopped, hands frozen at 0814, though his wrist unit had a battery rated for years of continuous use. Mine did the same 40 meters further. Ramirez's flashlight flickered, dimmed, then brightened again without explanation, and none of us said anything about it because saying it out loud would have made it real in a way we weren't ready for yet. The corridor opened into a chamber roughly 30 meters wide, and that's when Voss stopped walking entirely, staring upward, her scanner hanging forgotten at her side. "That's not possible," she whispered. I followed her gaze. The ceiling of the chamber, based on our approach and the external dimensions of the structure, should have been maybe 8 meters above us at most. It wasn't. It extended upward into darkness our flashlights couldn't reach, easily 30, maybe 40 meters, disappearing into a black so complete it felt like staring into a hole cut through the world itself. The chamber, by every law of physical space, was larger on the inside than the entire structure appeared from the outside. I felt something shift in my chest, a primal recognition that the rules I'd trusted my whole life, the ones that said inside cannot be bigger than outside, that said matter cannot occupy contradictory space, had just quietly, invisibly broken. Voss took a slow breath and turned to me, her flashlight trembling in her grip. "Sergeant, I need you to see something before I report this to command," she said. "There's a smaller chamber branching off the east wall. It wasn't on any thermal scan from outside. It shouldn't be there, but I can hear something moving inside it." Behind her, in the vast black expanse above, I thought I heard something too. Not footsteps, not wind, but a slow, deep, rhythmic sound, like breathing, vast and patient, echoing down from a ceiling that shouldn't exist. Voss finds a chamber inside that shouldn't fit inside the structure's outer dimensions, and asks me to see it before she tells command. The east wall chamber was smaller, tighter, barely large enough for 3 of us to stand upright, and the moment we stepped inside, I understood why Voss's voice had shaken. Our flashlights cast light without heat. I don't know how else to describe it. In that cold stone room, the beams illuminated everything perfectly, throwing sharp shadows across the walls. But I felt none of the warmth a light source that bright should generate against my skin. I held my hand directly in the beam and felt nothing but the ambient chill of the chamber itself. Doyle noticed it too. He held his palm up, moved it through the light repeatedly, his face tightening with a fear he couldn't articulate. "Sarge," he said quietly, "light's supposed to carry heat. Basic physics. This isn't..." He didn't finish the sentence. There wasn't a way to finish it that made sense. Voss knelt at the center of the chamber floor, where a shallow depression had been carved into the stone, filled with a dark, viscous substance that didn't reflect our lights at all, absorbing them completely, like staring into a pool of liquid midnight. She didn't touch it. She just stared, her scanner reading scrolling numbers that meant nothing to me, but clearly meant everything to her, because her hands had started shaking so badly, she nearly dropped the device twice. "Radiometric signature is inconsistent with any known element," she said, her voice flat, clinical, the tone people use when they're trying to hold themselves together through sheer procedure. "It's not decaying, it's not degrading. If anything, the readings suggest it's..." She trailed off. "Suggest what?" I pressed. "Growing," she finished. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, but growing. That's when Ramirez's watch, the one that had stopped at 08:14 back in the corridor, began ticking backward. I watched it happen with my own eyes, the second hand sweeping counterclockwise for exactly 9 seconds before snapping forward again, resetting itself to a time that didn't match anything. 0814 became 0805, then jumped forward to 0822, as if time inside that chamber wasn't a river flowing one direction, but a tide, pulling backward and forward against some rhythm none of us could perceive. Nobody spoke for almost a full minute. The silence in that chamber wasn't peaceful. It had weight, pressure, like standing at the bottom of very deep water, my ears popping slightly from a change in pressure I couldn't explain, given we hadn't changed elevation. Voss finally broke the silence, and her theory, delivered in a hushed, clinical whisper, chilled me more than anything I'd seen yet. "I think this predates human civilization. I think it might predate the planet itself. I think whatever built this wasn't building a structure the way we understand building. I think they were building a container." She looked up at me. "And I think we just walked inside it." I asked her to elaborate. She couldn't or wouldn't. She just kept staring at that pool of dark liquid, at the way it seemed to pulse faintly, rhythmically, in time with that deep hum we'd first felt outside the structure. A hum that had never stopped, that I realize now had been present since the moment our boots first touched that impossible black seam in the sand. Doyle backed toward the doorway, his weapon raised though he had nothing to aim it at, his breathing shallow and fast. "Sarge, I don't like this room. I don't like any of this. We need to call it in and get out." I agreed. God, I agreed completely. We turned to leave the small chamber, to return to the main hall and figure out some way to re-establish comms, some way to get eyes from command on what we'd found before we did anything else. That's when the wall opposite the pool, the far wall of the main chamber, the one none of us had examined closely because our attention had been locked on the vertical darkness above, moved. Not cracked, not shifted like an earthquake. It expanded and contracted, slow and rhythmic, in perfect time, with that deep hum vibrating through the stone beneath our boots. Expanded, contracted, expanded, contracted, like a lung, like the wall itself was breathing. Voss grabbed my arm so hard I felt her nails through my sleeve. "Sergeant," she whispered, her voice breaking for the first time since I'd met her. "I don't think that's a wall." That's when the wall at the far end of the chamber starts breathing. We ran. There's no dignified way to describe it. Discipline, training, rank. All of it evaporated the second that wall exhaled, and I mean exhaled. A slow release of stale, mineral-thick air that rolled across the chamber floor like fog, carrying with it a smell of something ancient and organic that I still can't fully describe without my hands shaking. We hit the corridor at a dead sprint, flashlights bouncing wild patterns across walls that seemed to lean inward as we passed, and I swear the vertical grooves carved into the stone had shifted position from when we'd walked in, though nobody stopped to confirm it. Confirming it meant looking, and looking meant slowing down, and slowing down felt like it might be the last mistake any of us ever made. We burst out of the entrance into daylight that hit wrong. The sun, still frozen in that same low position it had occupied for hours, now sat behind something that hadn't been there when we entered. A thin, hairline fracture running directly through the disk of the sun itself, splitting outward from that point like a crack spreading through glass struck from behind. It stretched horizon to horizon, visible even in daylight, a black seam against blue sky, exactly like the black seam we'd followed through the sand hours earlier, except this one hung suspended above the entire world. Doyle screamed something I couldn't process at the time, words that didn't fit together into meaning, and I turned to see him staring straight up, weapon forgotten at his feet, tears streaming down a face gone completely white. I followed his gaze and understood. Behind the crack in the sky, not clouds, not atmosphere, not stars, something moved. Vast. Impossibly vast. Filling the gap between the torn edges of what I had spent my entire life believing was simply sky, a shifting mass of shadow and dim, pulsing light that had no discernible shape because it was too large, too close, too present to comprehend as an object. It didn't announce itself with sound or violence. It simply existed there, visible now, as though a curtain had been pulled back from something that had always been standing directly behind it, patient, indifferent, and utterly incomprehensible. Ramirez broke first. He turned and ran, screaming for extraction on a radio that still produced nothing but static, sprinting away from the structure and directly out into open desert with no clear direction, no plan, just raw animal panic driving his legs. Doyle went after him, shouting his name. I called for them both to fall back, to hold formation, every ounce of training in my body screaming that scattering was death. Neither of them listened. I don't blame them. Some part of me wanted to run too. I never saw Ramirez again. Doyle came back 40 minutes later, alone, his uniform torn, his hands bleeding from what looked like he'd clawed at his own palms, muttering something about the ground moving beneath him, about shadows that didn't match anyone's shape, about voices that spoke in a language his brain kept trying and failing to translate into something his ears could accept as sound. Voss grabbed my arm again, harder this time, and when I turned to her, her eyes were fixed not on the sky, but on the structure behind us. "We weren't supposed to see this," she said, her voice barely a whisper over the wind that had suddenly, inexplicably picked up, hot and dry and carrying that same mineral smell from inside the chamber. "This isn't a discovery, Sergeant. We didn't find this by accident. We were led here. We were meant to be found by it." I tried the radio one final time, some desperate reflex refusing to accept that we were alone. That command had abandoned us the moment we crossed whatever threshold separated the ordinary desert from this. Static answered, thick and directionless, until, for one impossible second, a voice cut through, garbled, distorted almost beyond recognition, speaking words that didn't sound entirely human in their cadence. I caught only fragments. Containment breach. Do not proceed. Structure is a marker, not a. Then the static swallowed it whole, and the channel went dead. Voss's face, when I looked at her, had gone past fear into something closer to resignation. A marker, she repeated quietly, staring up at that torn seam in the sky, at the vast, shifting presence filling the gap behind it. Not a discovery, a warning label, and we just walked past it into the building. The ground beneath us pulsed once, hard, a vibration I felt through my boots and up into my teeth, and somewhere beneath the structure, deep in the earth, something massive shifted position for the first time since we'd arrived. Command goes silent on every channel, and Voss whispers that we were never meant to reach this chamber at all. We were meant to be found by it. Against every instinct screaming at me to retreat, I made the decision that still haunts me more than anything else that happened that day. I ordered us back toward the structure. I told myself it was tactical, that whatever answers existed inside, and that running blind into open desert with a fractured sky overhead and a screaming, bleeding Doyle at my side was its own kind of death sentence. The truth is simpler and uglier. I was afraid of the open sky more than I was afraid of the dark corridor. At least the corridor had walls. At least inside, I couldn't see that thing filling the crack above us. Voss led us not back to the main chamber, but along a passage we hadn't noticed before, one that sloped sharply downward, deeper than the structure's foundation should have allowed. The vertical grooves in the walls here were denser, deeper, and this close I finally understood what they resembled. Not writing, not decoration, but something closer to scar tissue, as if the stone itself had been wounded repeatedly over an incomprehensible span of time and healed around each injury. The passage ended in an opening far larger than anything we'd encountered yet, a cavern whose ceiling I couldn't find with my flashlight no matter how I angled the beam, and whose floor sloped down toward a depression at the center. A depression filled not with stone or liquid, but with something that looked impossibly organic. Ridged, pulsing faintly with that same rhythm as the breathing wall above. And at the center of that depression, half submerged in whatever dark material filled it, was an eye. I want to be precise, because precision is the only thing keeping me sane while writing this. It was not eye-shaped in the way I mean a human eye or an animal eye. It was vast beyond any scale my mind could process on first look. Easily the width of a football field, its surface a deep, churning black shot through with threads of dim, cold light that moved independently across its surface like veins carrying something other than blood. It did not blink. It did not need to. And the moment our combined flashlights swept across its surface, it turned, slow and deliberate, and looked directly at us. I have been in combat. I have had men aim rifles at my chest from 30 meters and felt less fear than I felt in that half second of recognition. The understanding that something on a scale beyond comprehension had noticed 6 insignificant creatures standing at the edge of its domain and had decided, simply by looking, to acknowledge that fact. Doyle went down first, collapsing to his knees, his bleeding hands pressed against his ears, screaming words that weren't words. Sounds that curled up out of his throat in patterns no human vocal cord should produce. Voss grabbed him, tried to pull him back from the edge of the depression, and that's when I noticed her own lips moving, murmuring something in that same alien cadence, though her eyes remained fixed and human, terrified, aware of what her own mouth was doing without her permission. The ground pulsed harder now, in perfect rhythm with the eye's slow, deliberate motion, each pulse sending a wave of pressure through the cavern that I felt in my sinuses, behind my eyes, deep in my chest like the onset of a violent migraine. My own radio, dead for hours, suddenly crackled once more, and this time the voice was clearer, closer to comprehensible, though every word came laced with something that made my skin crawl to hear. Do not let it fully wake. That was the entire transmission. 5 words, garbled at the edges, delivered in a tone I couldn't place as human or otherwise, followed immediately by silence so complete it felt like the static itself had been swallowed. I looked at Voss. She looked at me. Tears streaming down a face, still murmuring words neither of us understood. And in that moment, I understood, with total clarity, that whatever training had brought me to this point in my career meant nothing here. There was no protocol for this. There was no chain of command capable of giving an order that made sense against something the size of a stadium, staring back at us from beneath the earth, fully, patiently, terribly aware. The eye's surface rippled once, slow, deliberate, and the dim light threading across it brightened, just slightly, just enough that I understood, somewhere beneath the animal panic screaming through every nerve in my body, that it wasn't simply looking at us, it was beginning to open. Command's final transmission, garbled and inhuman, gives us one order: do not let it fully wake. What happened next, I've told 3 different psychiatrists 3 different versions, not because I'm lying, but because my own memory refuses to hold the sequence together the same way twice. I'll tell it as best I can, and you'll have to accept that some of it might not be entirely linear, because nothing about that cavern respected linear anymore. Gravity failed first, in patches, not everywhere, not all at once. Doyle, still on his knees near the edge of the depression, suddenly lifted off the ground half a meter, hovering, screaming louder as loose debris around him did the same, small stones and dust rising in defiance of every law I'd ever trusted, before crashing back down seconds later when whatever field had lifted them released without warning. My own body felt it too, a sickening lightness in my stomach, the sensation of falling while standing perfectly still. Our shadows stopped matching our movements. I watched my own shadow, cast long and thin against the cavern wall by Voss's flashlight, take one full step in a direction I hadn't moved, before snapping back into alignment with my actual position, leaving behind an afterimage that lingered half a second too long, like a photograph slowly fading rather than an instant response to light. Then the 2 men fell apart, not physically, but in every way that mattered. They were the 2 who had stayed with us through the corridor, whose names I won't include here, out of some lingering respect for what they became in those final minutes. Because it wasn't them anymore. Not really. One of them turned to the other and accused him, screaming, spit flying, of being an imposter, of wearing a dead man's face, insisting the real man had died back in the small chamber and something had crawled into his skin. The accused soldier didn't deny it calmly. He didn't deny it at all. He simply stared back with an expression I can only describe as confusion so absolute it had curdled into something like rage, and within seconds they were on each other, fists and boots and screaming, 2 trained soldiers who had eaten meals together for years trying to kill each other over a delusion neither of them could explain or escape. I couldn't stop them. Every time I moved toward them, the ground beneath my boots seemed to stretch, distances lengthening impossibly, so that no matter how many steps I took, they remained the same distance away, locked in their violence like a loop I couldn't break into. Voss screamed at me over the noise, over Doyle's continued wailing, over the low, building roar that seemed to emanate directly from the eye itself now, a sound like grinding stone mixed with something closer to a vast, slow exhale. "We have to seal it," she shouted. "We have to seal the chamber, now. Whatever charges we're carrying, use them now." I didn't fully understand her reasoning, and honestly, I'm not certain she did either. But some primal instinct beneath all my training agreed with her completely. I pulled the demolition charges from my pack, standard breach charges, nowhere near powerful enough to do meaningful damage to a cavern this size, let alone to something the scale of what lay in that depression. And I set them against the passage walls anyway, because doing something, anything, felt infinitely better than standing paralyzed while 2 of my men tore each other apart and a third hovered off the ground, screaming in tongues. I grabbed Voss, pulled her back toward the passage, leaving the 2 fighting men behind because there was nothing left of them to save. Only Doyle, who I hauled up bodily, one arm slung over my shoulder as he continued muttering incomprehensibly against my ear. We reached what I judged to be a safe distance, and I triggered the charges. The detonation didn't destroy anything. I want to be honest about that, because in every version of this story, Someone expects an explosion, collapse, closure, some kind of resolution through force. It didn't happen. The charges went off, the sound flat and small against the vast roar filling the cavern, barely a whisper against the true scale of what surrounded us. But something happened anyway. The eye, vast and patient and endlessly aware, blinked. Once. A slow, deliberate closing and opening that sent a shockwave of pressure through the cavern strong enough to knock all three of us to the ground, strong enough that I felt blood trickle from my nose, my ears ringing with a silence so total it felt like drowning. And then, impossibly, the light around us changed. When the light returns, we are standing in the exact spot we started, and command insists the mission never happened. We came to on flat, open desert, 40 kilometers past the wire, in the exact grid coordinates where the Black Hawks had first set us down. No structure, no black seam in the sand, no cavern, no eye, no wall that breathed. Just three of us, Voss, Doyle, and myself, lying in the sand beneath a sky that looked, for all appearances, perfectly ordinary. Blue, unmarked, no hairline fracture running horizon to horizon. Extraction found us within the hour, alerted by a distress beacon none of us remembered activating. We were flown out under complete medical isolation, debriefed separately, repeatedly, by men and women who never gave their names and asked the same questions in slightly different orders, over and over, for what felt like weeks. They told us the mission never happened. Not in those words exactly. The official language was cleaner, more clinical. Operation did not meet mission parameters. Personnel involved will be reassigned pending psychological evaluation. I read that sentence a dozen times before I understood what it meant. It meant erased. It meant that whatever we had seen, whatever had happened to Ramirez and the two men who never made it out of that cavern, would exist nowhere except in our own damaged memories, unsupported by any record, denied by every authority we'd once trusted with our lives. Voss disappeared from every database within a month. I tried to find her through old contacts, through anyone who might know where she'd been reassigned. Nothing. No transfer record, no forwarding address. It was as though the version of her that had knelt beside that impossible black liquid, that had murmured words in a language her own mouth didn't understand, had simply ceased to have ever existed, the way the mission itself had ceased to exist on paper. Doyle didn't fare much better, though he survived, physically at least. I saw him once, 8 months later, in a psychiatric facility neither of us was supposed to acknowledge existed. He didn't recognize me at first. When he did, all he said was, "The sun still isn't moving right, is it? Tell me it's moving right where you are." I told him it was. I don't know if that was true, or if I just needed to say it out loud for both our sakes. As for me, I was quietly discharged 11 months later, citing unrelated medical reasons, with a pension and a gag order thick enough to survive any lawyer I might have tried to hire. I signed it. Of course I signed it. What was I going to say in a courtroom that wouldn't get me committed alongside Doyle? I still see it though. Not every night, but often enough. That thin fracture line, faint now, healing slower than a scar should, visible only in specific light, at specific angles, if you know exactly where and how to look. I've stood outside at 3 a.m. more times than I'd like to admit, staring straight up, searching the dark for that hairline crack, half hoping I've simply lost my mind, because the alternative is so much worse. The alternative is that it's still there, that it never fully closed, that whatever vast, patient, endlessly aware thing lay beneath that structure, watching us with an eye the size of a stadium, only blinked once and settled back into whatever waiting it had been doing for 11,000 years or longer, before we ever stumbled into its domain uninvited. I don't sleep well anymore. I don't think any of us who walked away from that place ever will. Because the deepest horror isn't what we saw, though God knows that alone would be enough to break most men. The deepest horror is the certainty I carry now. The thing I can't unknow, no matter how many psychiatrists tell me it was stress, hallucination, some group delusion born of heat exhaustion and dehydration. We were never the ones in control of that operation. We were never the observers we believed ourselves to be, standing at a safe, scientific distance from something ancient and unknowable. We were the ones being observed the entire time, from the moment that Colonel slid an empty folder across a windowless table, to the moment 3 broken soldiers were found lying in open desert with no memory of how they got there. And I don't think observation has ended. I think it's still going on right now, somewhere above the sky we've all agreed to pretend is solid, unbroken, entirely ours. This story is inspired by documented wartime reports, blended with folklore, and dramatized for narrative purposes.